Tonight's the scariest night of the year. It's Halloween. And I'm going to talk to Professor Frank Hentschel about the music of horror movies. So this is Ansset, and you are welcome to Soundfiles, your channel for audio inspiration. So hit like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever a new sound file is ready to be processed.
I'm Frank Hentschel. I'm a musicologist of historical musicology, and one of my research areas is film music. And one of the books I've written is a book on music in the horror film. I have other areas of research, like in the 19th century, for example, dealing with historical music psychology. Still, film music is one of my areas I'm working on. There is a lot of interest in that subject, but in the history of musicology and the discipline, this is actually not a topic many people have been working on. Actually, there didn't exist any book on the subject. And I remember when I started doing this at Free University in Berlin, a colleague of mine found this very strange to take these movies seriously. But I think one should take them seriously, and I also think that the music in the horror films is especially interesting. From the point of view of a musicologist, which is actually not the main point of view I have taken when writing the book, but from the point of view of a musicologist, it's really interesting that starting around 1970, horror films started to use a kind of music, new music with a large N capital, was known only to a very small number of specialists. But then the horror film is a very popular genre, and this very special music suddenly had a very big and unusual audience, only they didn't really realize, because they were interested in the horror film and didn't really realize what kind of music they were listening to while the movie was going on. This kind of new music is characterized by really denying almost everything which is usual in more popular music. So they don't have a grammar, a harmonic grammar or so. They don't use regular rhythms. They manipulate the instruments. They use often electronics very early on, before popular music did so. So actually, in some sense, or in most senses actually, of what you know about music, this music is different. And you cannot dance to it, you cannot sing along. It's very different, it's very dissonant. If you just listen to the music, to many people this is no pleasure, but it's more stress to listen to that music, if you're not familiar with it. The book deals with horror movies from the 70s, because I think, especially in terms of music, these films are those who really established this kind of film music for the horror film. But there's a little chapter where I'm looking further back into the music history of the film history, because there are some movies that prepared some of the ways the music is being used in the horror film. And one of these films is Forbidden Planet, from I think 1956, which is the first movie to use exclusively electronic music, and where also there are some historical documents that make the point that this music was supposed to be eerie, so some kind of uncanny, frightening in that sense, and very unusual. It's not a familiar kind of music, but it should sound strange and different, because it's playing on another planet, and it's dealing with a very foreign culture from that planet. This kind of music has an expressive power which exactly matches the needs of a horror film. It's ideal to express anxiety, to express stress, and just to intensify those expressions that, those expressive qualities that a horror film really aims at. One probably has to differentiate between movies that are iconic for a special kind of use of the music, on the one hand, and those movies which are iconic as horror movies. And very often this is a match, but not always. But for example, maybe not the entire movie, which is as a horror film, if you wish. I'm not sure whether I should you call it a horror film, but the movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock is of course iconic as a kind of a horror film or a psycho thriller, and especially the scene in the shower is of course iconic also for the music, because it's a very short section only of the movie, but in that section the composer Bernard Herrmann really uses very early in 1960 many features that are typical for new music. And it's very interesting, since the music of the entire movie is rather traditional. But in this specific scene, which is a very strange scene really, he switches to the new music. So he, first I think you have to understand that in terms of the dramaturgy of the movie, this scene is very extreme in a sense, because the movie establishes a protagonist for about 45 minutes, and then suddenly this protagonist is dead. And this happens in the shower scene, and so the audience is lost somehow in the story of the movie. Everybody is lost. And at the same time, of course, Marion Crane, the protagonist in the shower, is extremely frightened because suddenly the killer is there, and at that point the music becomes totally atonal, produces a cluster of dissonant sounds, which in a certain sense you could say that they leave the context of music. It's really more like a noise that the music is producing. There's no melody, there's no harmony, there's a bit of a rhythm, because the music in that case imitates the rhythm of the murderer who is using the knife to kill Marion Crane, and the music somehow seems to imitate that rhythm. But this is the only traditional element musically in the scene, and this intensifies in that moment the stress, and I think that those harsh dissonances that this music can produce transfer the bodily element of the movie, because it's a very violent kind of murder. It's very bloody, and so you see much of the body and of the vulnerability of the body, and music which produces sounds that also seem to hurt the body, in that they are very loud and dissonant. And I think this is an element which is being used very often in horror films. And the shower scene with the music by Bernard Herrmann is certainly a very early and very famous example for that. Other movies which are iconic, I think, are the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for using noises as music in the horror film, because it's a very early example of a horror film that really exclusively uses noises instead of music in a traditional sense. I consider this also music, but it's not a music in the sense we usually use the term. And in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre also, it's interesting to see, which is also typical for many horror films, that the difference between music and sound design is being blurred all the time, especially starting about at the middle of the movie when the chainsaw really comes into play, because in the first half there is no chainsaw, but then it plays a role, and it gets more and more important as the movie goes on. And so, of course, the noise of the chainsaw also becomes more and more present in the second half of the movie, and finding only a climax in the showdown, during the showdown. But it's not only the chainsaw, it's also the noise of a truck, which you're seeing and on the scene during the showdown, the screams of the protagonist, which is surviving, and even there noises from kind of an extra-diegetic noises, so noises which are have not any source in the movie itself, but are produced like film music. And all this is being mixed together in during the showdown of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But even in the beginning of the movie, you are constantly being confronted with some kind of noises which produce a very strange and uncomfortable atmosphere during the movie. It's something you really feel very, very strongly as the movie seems to end. After the showdown, you get a black screen, and there's no noise anymore, and you really get the feeling that it's good to have this silence and everything seems to be over. Only Tobe Hooper, the director, doesn't let you leave that easy, but he starts again with the noises during the end credits. But you get, during that moment where it's really, where there's really silence, you get the feeling of how much these noises stressed you during the movie. The genre of horror films really established around 1970 a very specific music, which you will not encounter in any other genre, and very often you just need to hear the music and you know there's a horror film going on. Still, one has to add that the kind of music existed in this very small area of new music, so that, for example, in another iconic movie, The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, he could just use the new music as it was existing. He didn't need a film composer, but he took a lot of pieces by Krzysztof Penderecki, Polish composer of new music. And in the movie, you instantly recognize this is typical horror film music, even though it has never been composed as such. But within the film world, so to speak, the horror genre really has its own language, I think. There's not only noise music and new music. I think these two kinds of music, which are very close to each other, it's different to differentiate between them. They really constitute what I would consider the specific musical language of the horror film. But one has to say that children's music and music boxes on the one hand and church music on the other hand are also very often being used in horror films. But of course these are musical languages we know from other contexts, which is the point, of course, to bring either a religious or children-related associations into the movie. So in that case, I wouldn't say that this is a genre-specific language, but still it is specific for the horror film to use these kinds of music very often. Children are very much associated with innocence, and also they are maybe those, what should I say, those living beings that under all circumstances you try to save for any harm. And so many horror films integrate this as the big threat of the movie, that a baby or a little child is getting hurt. using this as a taboo, which you know most horror films won't touch, but they use this as a threat. But then, of course, some horror films do touch the taboo, and there are horror films where babies or little children get killed. But either way, of course, the music makes sense as a symbol of this innocence and this life that cannot protect itself and needs help, and is much more than adults' easy victim for the monster of the horror film. So I think the innocence and the aspect of protection are very central. But then there is another strand of horror films which use the same associations, but then turn it upside down, because there are quite some horror films in which the children really are the monsters. And they are very, also in terms of interpretation, often very complex movies. Maybe one of the most famous ones is It's Alive by Larry Cohen, where even instantly after the birth of the child, it starts a bloodbath in the hospital. And then the movie deals with the strange feelings of the parents who don't know whether they should kill the monster or love their child, because it's the same being. And of course, very famous, much more popular, is Rosemary's Baby, where a baby which is obviously the baby of the devil, or the devil himself, you don't really exactly know. And you have the same point at the end of the movie where the mother possibly starts to accept the child as her own. And this film also uses children's music. In this case, actually a lullaby, a very famous lullaby, which is, and this is also typical for many horror films. This lullaby is manipulated. It's on the surface, it sounds like a normal lullaby, and it's very melodious. You can sing along easily, but then there are very strange dissonances and tiny harmonic, unusual things in the music, which make clear there's something wrong with this child, which you learn at the end of the movie, of course. Film composers can use the music in all kinds of ways, of course. And an easy example is that many film composers use, even for the horror films, rather normal, traditional film music. But in the scenes, for example, in splatter scenes, then switch to another kind of music. Like I said in Psycho, it's just in the shower scene where the music really changes. Other horror films, or the film composers actually decided to use only noise music or only new music through the entire movie, which generates another atmosphere in watching the movie. And of course, the music differs between splatter scenes or psychological horror scenes. New music can be used to really produce the uncanny, which you would more often find in psychological horror scenes. And then the music is rather low volume. It's just not so present, not so loud, not so fast. Also, it's using some noises in low volume where you don't really know how they are produced, where do they come from. Or a good example is, again, in The Shining, the music by Penderecki. When in the movie the ghosts really come into play, Kubrick uses rather low volume music by Penderecki, which somehow alludes to traditional music, but isn't really. So it seems a moment long familiar, but then you realize it's not familiar. There's something very strange about the music. And so I think the music, in that case, I even think that the music without the movie would be uncanny, which doesn't work very often, but I think there are some examples where music really can be uncanny without the movie. But together with the pictures in The Shining, I think it's working very well in producing the uncanny. On the other hand, in splatter scenes, or I know splatter is still another matter, but if I start with in the scenes where the monster suddenly is present, the music usually gets very loud and imitates, again, in a sense, this bodily threat which is there, and produces a lot of dissonances, maybe very high or maybe shrill also, so that you really get hurt by the sound. And also it very much supports the being stressed by what is going on in the movie. So that in the best case, you get a faster heartbeat and so on in these scenes, and this is very much supported by the music. Splatter scenes are scenes where you see, of course, a lot of blood and it's on the inside of the body. And these are scenes in which you very often also get to hear the body. Something you very often encounter in horror films is heartbeat rhythm. And I realized two things. The first, you very often hear it when you really, when the movie allows you to look inside the body. There's a scene, for example, in Dario Argento's Suspiria, where you see the knife in the heart of the victim, and everything is open and it's still beating. Don't know whether that's possible, but it's still beating, and the knife is in there, and you get the heartbeat rhythm. And the other thing I realized when analyzing those scenes with heartbeats is that those heartbeats are very, very slow. They're much slower than a healthy heart would beat. And this is against a first assumption you might have, namely that the heartbeat imitates the moment of being excited, being anxious, where the heart would beat faster, of course. But the opposite is the case. They are using a much slower time to do this, I think, to make you feel the bodily aspect and the vulnerability of the body, because somehow I feel that those slow heartbeats make you realize what's going on inside your body, and so you can relate to what's going on the screen in the horror film. I personally find also interesting why they're using sacred music in horror films, and I think that this might have to do with the fact that while usually in our very rational culture, at least the supernatural horror films seem to be far away of what we accept, and philosophers very often discussed also how can those movies produce fear if you don't at all believe in all those ghosts and demons and so on. And so I just have the hypothesis that using sacred music opens the field of our culture where believing in the supernatural is established, because that is the area where many people do believe in that kind of beings. And also the Bible, of course, is full of horrible scenes, and so they really fit very well into the genre. And I think so that's one of the basic ways how the sacred music comes in. And it's very interesting that in 1917 a very important book on the holy appeared, Rudolf Otto, Das Heilige, where he actually explained that having the experience of the holy is like reading a Gothic novel, or the horrible scenes of a Gothic novel, because he says that this combination of the fascinating and the horrible aspects you also experience in experiencing God or the holy. And so I think it's very interesting that this kind of religiosity and the fascination of the horror movie, which is also a mixture of fear and fascination, really seems to have something similar in the way it's being experienced And yeah, I think the sacred music picks that up and uses these mechanisms.
Latin Quarter had a dedicated lyric writer from Liverpool. And yes, the lyrics are outstanding. Political yet personal. The most personal is the most generic, so to speak. Both story and craftsmanship are on the absolute highest level on modern times. And there was even an insert that informed the interested German listener what the songs were about. The music was filed under intelligent pop at the time of the release, drawing from reggae and other influences. All the songs are special in their own right, but Coro absolutely stands out. Its haunting quality grabs your attention and it won't let you go.